Hello and welcome to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Today we are discussing the contest between the UAE and Qatar, a rivalry between these two countries, these two very, very wealthy kingdoms, has been one of the major stories of the Arab Spring in the past 10 years. Both have played a key role in the Arab Spring, but they have played a very contrasting and very divisive role in many, many ways. The rivalry reached its peak under US President Donald Trump in 2017, when UAE and its allies with Saudi Arabia imposed a blockade on Qatar. The blockade was finally lifted last month, but only after former US President Donald Trump was replaced in the White House. So in the next 30 minutes or so, we'll be digging deeper into this rivalry and look at how the different visions of the two countries, despite their small size, has shaped events in the region and what their respective vision means for the future. And to discuss these issues, I am joined by David Warren. David is a postdoctoral fellow at Washington University, St. Louis. His research examines the politics of the Muslim scholarly elite, the ulama, with a particular focus on the Gulf states. He is the author of Rivals in the Gulf, Yusuf Al-Qaradawi, Abdullah Bin Bayyah, and the Qatar-UAE contest over the Arab Spring and the Gulf crisis. So welcome, David, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
The book is quite a technical book, your recent publication, which I mentioned. But before we get into discussing your book, let's focus on your work and the views, and tell us a bit about what we are actually discussing today, the phenomenon of politics and Muslim scholarly elite. It's quite a technical subject, but just give us a brief background of your work and what you do.
Yes, thank you. So as you mentioned, my research focuses on this elite scholar class known as the ulama. These are the scholars who have trained at these ancient centers of Islamic learning, like Al-Azhar in Cairo or Medina, places like that. And I look at the role that they play in Arab politics. Just thinking about them and why this could be so interesting. For a long time, particularly in Western academia, this elite scholar class was thought of as comparable to sort of Christian clergy. And the assumption was, for a long time, was that as states in the Arab world became modern, as they saw it, this kind of scholarly class / clergy would simply fade away and become irrelevant, right? This sort of development studies kind of theory. That hasn't happened. By contrast, as new competitors have arisen to compete with the ulama as voices of Islam in the Arab world and more broadly, the ulama have actually rebranded themselves, we might say, as guardians of tradition in a secular age, which is a very important and a very powerful position to have. And they've shown themselves to be a very dynamic, very ingenious, very creative scholar class. So that's why they're so interesting. And I focus on, in this book, particularly their relationship with regimes and rulers, particularly in this case, Qatar and the UAE.
And that's fascinating and interesting. I think the Arab Spring kind of demonstrated this linkage and connection in a way we've not seen in many, many years. But before we get to the Arab Spring, I think it's also worth basically bringing us up to speed and give us a quick summary of the respective roles of the two countries during the initial phase of the Arab Spring.
Yeah, so I think the first point to remember, particularly with the Gulf states like Qatar and the UAE, is on the one hand, these are enormously powerful states financially and so on, but also they're very vulnerable with these sort of tiny militaries. And both Qatar and the UAE, and also Kuwait and Bahrain, have also had parts of their territory either claimed or occupied by their much larger neighbors, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and so on. So for these tiny states, it's very important for their security to continue to demonstrate their usefulness and continue to engender the interest of outside powers in maintaining their security, the US particularly. So that brings to the Arab Spring. I mentioned that because in Libya in 2011, both Qatar and the UAE joined in the NATO intervention against Gaddafi. And that part of that was sort of demonstrating to outside powers, European powers, the US, that these two states were important to maintain independence and be protected as they were powerful actors in the region. Thinking back to the Arab Spring particularly, Qatar, of course, and Sheikh Al-Qaradawi as a sort of figurehead in Qatar was very supportive, both sort of verbally and also financially later. The uprisings in Tunisia, Egypt, and so on. Whereas eventually the UAE, by contrast, came to find the Arab Spring very threatening, particularly the election of Mohamed Morsi in Egypt in 2012, and then began to become one of the leading forces in supporting a sort of counter-revolutionary trend, particularly in Egypt.
It is interesting, though, that they should play such a polarizing role in the Arab Spring. Both countries they have a very similar composition. Founded in 1971, they are, as you said, small kingdoms, very similar economy, and very similar in the way they try and advance, in many ways, US security interest in the region. So how is it that they ended up in such different camps? One viewed, this is Qatar viewed the UAE viewed the popular uprising as an existential threat almost. And on the other hand, you had Qatar, who supported the democratic transition. So how did they ended up in such polarizing positions?
Yes, that's a really interesting question, especially since both Qatar and the UAE have a history of having intellectuals and scholars and members of the Muslim Brotherhood in those states, right? Since the 1960s, there was a period of emigration from countries like Egypt, sort of skilled labor emigration from countries like Egypt or Syria to the Gulf. And many of those emigrants worked as teachers, sort of professional classes, and many of them were affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood at the time, right? And they left those countries to the Gulf, and they were there and performed their activities. So both of them have a history of presence of the Muslim Brotherhood. One reason why Qatar wasn't threatened in the same way the UAE was initially was that there is no local branch of, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood in Qatar that was campaigning or organizing for democratic reforms in that sense. Whereas in the UAE there was, particularly in March 2011. There was an action that seems very benign in contrast to what was going on in the rest of the region, but there was a petition presented to the ruling family. And it was a petition asking for quite mild reforms, really, a bit more sort of democratic governance, a bit more accountability, things like that. But what sort of terrified the UAE at the time was that among sort of the signatories, sort of hundreds of signatories, there was both members of the local Muslim Brotherhood branches that had been tolerated for a while in the country, but also liberals, intellectuals. So in the UAE, it was seen as an existential threat, a kind of coming together of broad swathes of Emirati society in a way it didn't happen in Qatar. At the same time, one reason that Qatar sort of initially didn't find the Arabs being threatening is they were sort of far away, Egypt, Tunisia, places like that. But both countries took part in the suppression of the Bahraini uprising. So both of them equally considered the Gulf region, sort of democratic uprisings there, untenable.
And how much of that do you put down to the fact that someone like Yusuf Al-Qaradawi, one of the scholars you study in your book, since 1961, I think, he's cultivated a kind of tolerance which allowed Qatar to align itself with the Arab people during the uprising. As you mentioned, he created the syllabus, he implemented many of his reform policies which he wanted to reform in Egypt through Azhar. So how much of that is down to the cultivation of a syllabus within Qatar over some 4 decades?
Well, The role, as I say in the book, the influence of Sheikh Al-Qaradawi in Qatar and Sheikh Bin Bayyah in the UAE is not quite so direct, in as much as they don't directly influence Qatari or Emirati foreign policy, in as much as these scholars don't sit with the rulers and actually influence foreign policy in that very direct fashion. Rather, as you mentioned, Sheikh Al-Qaradawi and also many scholars from his sort of milieu, his background, have been in Qatar for decades, who initially came in the 60s and 50s to sort of fill up a sort of skilled labor shortage in religious scholars in Qatar at the time, as Qatar was building up its Islamic State education system. Scholars like Qaradawi were brought in from places like Egypt to act as teachers effectively. So the impact of Sheikh Al-Qaradawi in Qatar and more broadly is in a more sort of nuanced and subtle sense. For him, he was part of a trend that sought to make this genre of Islamic law that was formerly a very elitist discourse, popularize it. So in the 1960s, 1970s and onward, he was part of a trend that tried to make the discourse and genre of Islamic law relevant and meaningful to everyday believers' lives, and to try and change it from being an elite discourse to being a popular discourse, right? And that meaningfulness could also be political as well. So it's in a much more sort of abstract sense that his influence happened there. By contrast, Bin Bayyah has a history also with the Al Thani royal family in the UAE. It goes back to the 70s as well. At the time, Abdullah Bin Bayyah was a politician in Mauritania. And at the time, as you mentioned, the UAE was a very new country. Sheikh Zayed Al Nahyan, the ruler, made a number of visits to Mauritania. Humanitarian aid was a big part of Emirati foreign policy. And so he and Abdullah Bin Bayyah developed quite a close relationship that the Sheikh still recalls very fondly. And at the time, the UAE was a massive aid donor to Mauritania, actually the largest at the time. And so one could suggest that Abdullah Bin Bayyah sort of saw in Sheikh Zayed Al Nahyan a kind of benevolent authoritarian.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting how the two scholars have developed their own branch of Islamic jurisprudence on political governance. I mean, they were previously part of the same scholarly group giving fatwas, and Bin Bayyah was his second in charge in many ways. Both advocate, as you mentioned, wasatiyya, the idea of moderation and centrism. And yet, following the Arab Spring, they've reached very, very contrasting conclusions, fundamentally about the nature of governance and politics. So summarize for us the two different views, both resting on wasatiyya, centrism, but then you have idea of fiqh al-thawr, fiqh of revolution, which Yusuf Al-Qaradawi, which you say subscribes to, and then you have a jurisprudence of Bin Bayyah, which is a jurisprudence of peace, silm, which really may not really be peace, but that's his view anyway. But summarize for us the two contrasting views on that.
Yes, thank you. So basically, as you said, as the Arab Spring unfolded, both of these two scholars took very different positions as to what was happening. Sheikh Al-Qaradawi saw this as an opportunity, whereas Abdullah Bin Bayyah saw the rising, what he saw as chaos and violence in the region as something deeply concerning, right? And so what they did was, initially Sheikh Al-Qaradawi first, but after that, Abdullah Bin Bayyah, they both began to formulate branches, as it were, of Islamic jurisprudence or fiqh. Sheikh Al-Qaradawi had this branch of thought called the jurisprudence of revolution, whereas Abdullah Bin Bayyah began to formulate a branch of thought called the jurisprudence of peace. And what those two branches of Islamic thought do is both of them start from the same place. So the vast diversity of the classical legal tradition, right? The way that classical authorities thought about rebellion in different ways, an incredibly diverse tradition. And what these two scholars do is they variously expand or contract different classical precedents. So for example, there has been a sort of long-running principle in classical thought that rebellion against a ruler is something to be avoided wherever possible, right? Qaradawi contracts that principle to being very narrow, saying the only kind of rebellion that should be avoided is sort of very violent rebellion against the ruler. And so these kinds of peaceful protests are something that we should be supporting, absolutely. He also expands this well-known principle of commanding the right and forbidding the wrong, sort of Quranic principle. And he says, well, let's expand this principle from being an individual obligation on a Muslim believer to being one on Muslim society as a whole. And he sees an equivalence between that principle and holding a ruler to account, right? And similarly, he expands the idea of someone bearing witness in a courtroom, for example, to elections, seeing an equivalence between Muslims electing a ruler to bearing witness to the suitability of somebody to rule the nation in a courtroom. Bin Bayyah does the opposite, right? So when he sort of takes this idea about a hesitancy in the classical tradition around supporting rebellions out of fear of violence, he expands that concept hugely to take in any and all forms of protest, right? In the opposite way that Qaradawi does. Sheikh Bin Bayyah, in this idea of jurisprudence of peace, which he talks about, is he foregrounds what he calls peace, by which he means the absence of violence, as the first condition from which all other rights must flow. So before you can do anything else, you must have the absence of violence. And that's what he foregrounds, whereas in contrast to Qaradawi.
Generally, when it comes to values and principles, everything has to be kept in moderation and in balance. Even ideas of justice, if it forecloses peace, it can lead to even more injustice and upheaval. So I'm wondering whether in your interviews with Bin Bayyah and his team, you've noticed, any sense that what they ascribe. For example, let me just share some of the views which his idea of peace advocates. So, for example, he says people must choose to defer their right to justice and accountability for the sake of peace. He says, for example, justice must be suspended for the sake of peace, things like this. But this sounds to me very similar to what the US policy has been in the region for many, many decades, which is to postpone political freedoms, postpone rights for the sake of stability. I wonder if in your interviews, you found that they were actually aware and conscious of the fact that some of what they're advocating really hasn't led to stability and peace. And if anything, it's endorsed what has been US foreign policy in the region for many, many decades.
Yes, thank you. So first of all, sadly, I wasn't able to actually interview Sheikh Bin Bayyah this time. So coronavirus and things like that made that the time in Abu Dhabi impossible, unfortunately. But I think in terms of seeing his views and sort of equivalence with US foreign policy, I don't think necessarily that he and his circle would see themselves as doing that. But what is interesting is that if we look at Bin Bayyah's publications and his statements and speeches, we can get a sense as to why he thinks this. So first of all, we can get a sense that it appears that he adopted this view based on his view of what was happening in Syria. In his understanding, he talked about this idea about societies where there's no common ground. If you bring about democracy, that will inevitably lead to violence, right, in his view. The reason he says this is because whoever loses an election, in his view, will be so terrified of the results, they'll automatically turn to violence to suppress that democratic culture. So in his view, which is very abstractly not applied to reality, any attempt to bring about democracy in a divided society will in effect lead to that failure of democracy, because whoever loses elections will always resort to violence because they're so frightened of the consequences. Okay, but also not just Syria, but when Bin Bayyah in his publications and speeches, he has a much more long-standing skepticism toward democracy, going back to his view of the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq and the chaos and bloodshed that happened there, which was ostensibly invaded to bring about democracy. Also, the Algerian Civil War as well, in the 1990s, he mentions as well. So he has a view which, based on his observations and interpretations, that simply attempting to implement democracy or trying to hold rulers to account because the rulers of the region are so vicious will always lead to violence and bloodshed. And in his view, is better off being offset. But in the way, as you pointed out, in the way he argues this, it should always be deferred, seemingly almost forever, in a way.
Yeah, I was also struck by how I don't want to use the word disdain, but there was a sense of elitism within the way a lot of these theories are being advocated. For example, I mean, the quarrel or disagreement over democracy, which basically means the rights of people to rule over for themselves, by themselves. It's not something that's quite ancient, old within Western tradition. Plato, for instance, has a very, very elitist view on how to govern a country. His ideal model was, as we know, the philosopher king, an autocracy ruled by a philosopher king. Bin Bayyah's version seems to be an autocracy ruled by a benevolent monarchy. I guess the question is, if those ideas now has a state platform in the shape of the UAE, are we seeing the foreclosing of the transition to democracy in the region? Are we going to see more and more obstructions to the Arab people's rights to govern themselves and enjoy the rights and political freedoms which are taken for granted in other parts of the world?
Yes, thank you. So the first point I'll just start with is the idea that, interestingly, both Sheikh Al-Qaradawi and Sheikh Bin Bayyah start from the same point of departure when they're thinking about democracy or authoritarianism, which is this Quranic concept of shura, or consultation, right? Whereas Sheikh Al-Qaradawi sees precedents for democratic rule within the example of the Prophet and other examples. And so he sees a particular sort of moral valence in democracy itself as a form of governance. Bin Bayyah is very different. He also sees consultation or governance through consultation as a good thing. But by contrast, he sees democracy as one form of consultation among many forms of governance, which in his view actually isn't a particularly good one. By contrast, so for him, he sees a kind of governance that consults with the people in any form, need not be democratic, as a good thing to do, but it need not be democratic. And so the UAE, in his view, which consults with its people in various ways, is sufficient. Thinking more broadly about this kind of foreclosing of democracy in the region, I think that, again, it's not the case that someone like Abdullah Bin Bayyah actually influences directly Emirati foreign policy. It's not as if he would sort of sit with the ruler and decide together and provide a kind of anti-democratic rationale. I mean, the UAE, Bin Bayyah and it's got a useful in a foreign policy sense. If the UAE decided they wanted to implement democracy, it would do. It need not listen to someone like a religious scholar. They don't play that kind of controlling role in that sense. But rather, so the importance of someone like Sheikh Bin Bayyah in the UAE context is now foreign policy and state branding, right? By which I mean Bin Bayyah's discourse of what he calls chaos, a sort of chaos of religious discourse, a sort of chaos of the region. That rhetoric becomes incorporated into Emirati rulers, Emirati officials' discourse, and they'll start to repeat that kind of language to justify their foreign policies. So, for example, in interviews, Bin Bayyah's view that the chaos of the region, as he sees it, has religious roots and has a religious solution. It's not to do with any other reasons. The UAE rulers and politicians absorb that discourse and they repeat it to justify their policies. Say, oh, there is indeed the reason there's chaos in the Arab region is because of religious interpretations or misinterpretations. And we, supporting scholars like Bin Bayyah, are a solution to that problem, okay, which is useful for them in a foreign policy area, but not in terms of their actual decisions of whether or not they're interested in democratic governance or not.
Yeah, which is quite an interesting point, because it deviates from a lot of what we know from socio-economic studies of the roots of terrorism and extremist groups like Daesh, for example. Many will cite a number of socio-economic research which shows that political grievances, inequality, repression all play a role in groups like Daesh. So I'm wondering how much room do they allow for this kind of research, part of a discourse within Western social science traditions, to play a part in their religious theorizing?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. One can imagine that someone like Sheikh Bin Bayyah is very much aware that sort of violence and conflict in the region isn't solely to do with sort of Islamic interpretations of texts. I think what's interesting to think about is when he says that, when he puts the roots of the rise of ISIS or Daesh due to sort of misinterpretation of Islamic texts, or sort of deviant fatwas, he calls it. That's not an act of kind of helpless submission to a sort of Western discourse as to why there's conflict in the region. Rather, it's actually an act of claim making on behalf of him and behalf of the Muslim scholarly elite who share his views. Because in his argument, if indeed the roots of violence in the region is due to Islam or misinterpretations of Islamic texts and traditions, then scholars like him are the solution to that problem. Right, so it's an act of claim making on behalf of the ulama. The reason that's important is a much broader context of what we generally refer to in academia as a sort of fragmentation of authority, which means in the past of a couple of centuries, you have seen a rise of competitors against the ulama to be the voices of Islam in the region, right? Alongside scholars like Bin Bayyah or Qaradawi, for that matter, you now have intellectuals who trained at secular institutions like Cairo University or in the secular humanities who also compete to speak in the name of Islam. You have politicians and military officers who also compete with the ulama to speak authoritatively in the name of Islam. With the rise of mass education, you have sort of the general reading public who no longer sort of look in as clear a fashion toward this scholarly elite for guidance about Islamic norms. So this kind of idea is also an act to demonstrate the continued need and importance for this scholarly elite as well.
I mean, we are coming to the end of our time, but I don't want to finish the show without asking you a more broader question about a lot of the initiatives of the UAE, for example, the Forum for the Promotion of Peace in Muslim Societies, and also Bin Bayyah's theory and where it sits within the global ecosystem, the highly securitized ecosystem of the US in the post 9/11 era, which looks at the Muslim world through a security lens, and which also looks at Muslim political participation through a security lens. And it's this kind of hostility against Muslims, which we are seeing in France, an ecosystem which has allowed for that, and also Muslims in concentration camps in China as well. I think this is all part of the post 9/11 ecosystem, which looks at Islam and Muslims in a very suspicious way. In your book, you mentioned that since 9/11, the US State Department has invested heavily in programmatic efforts to reshape and transform Islam from within. And as part of its post 9/11 security and foreign policy, this is a part of its goal and aspirations. So how do you see the UAE and its forums and its initiatives and Bin Bayyah's ideas sitting within the ecosystem and a prism of security through which they view Islam and Muslims? It's a long question, but I think you kind of understand where I'm coming from in this.
Absolutely, yeah, it's a really great question. I think so. The first of all, in a general sense, absolutely, we can see the way that the UAE created this forum in 2014 called the Forum for Promoting Peace in Muslim Societies, which was led by Bin Bayyah, fits into this broad context of viewing Islam through a lens of security. And when this, going back to 9/11, when you mentioned the US, What's interesting is that initially, the US State Department was very invested in reshaping Islam from within as they thought about it. But that meant to them promoting secularism, finding secular intellectuals and supporting them, even if they're critical of US policy in a direct sense. But there was this vision that secularism, as they understood it, was the solution to the problems of the Arab world as the US envisaged it. What's interesting, since sort of 2014, or sort of the rise of the Christian right in the US particularly, is a kind of shift. Now, in contrast to promoting sort of secularism in an outward sense, you now see US foreign policy supporting a particular kind of Muslim religiosity, right, which goes into this concept that's now being used called Abrahamic morality, a kind of very conservative religiosity that unites Jews, Christians, and Muslims, right? And actually that concept is testament to the efforts of Hamza Yusuf, in part, Bin Bayyah's deputy, who has formed particularly close links with the Christian right in the US, in having a general sense of, rather than supporting secularism in the region, the US instead looks to support what they understand as traditional Islam, or what they understand as kind of a conservative form of Islam that has no interest in politics or democracy, right? And so the UAE and the Forum for Promoting Peace in Muslim Societies fits into that into that trend because of state branding, right? This idea that the UAE has a brand of Islamic reform it's promoting, right? Which fits into that need as the US sees it. People like Sheikh Bin Bayyah and his allies say that we are part of this wider Abrahamic religiosity. And the truth of that religiosity is that we're not interested in democratic reforms. We're not interested in justice and accountability in that sense of the word. Rather, we share with also Christian and Jewish brothers and sisters this kind of very conservative morality. But again, no particular need for democracy as an end in itself. Right?
So really, really fascinating, David. Thank you very much. I mean, unfortunately, we have come to the end of our time, and I really appreciate your time and your thoughts. And I look forward to having more conversations with you. Thank you all at home for joining us. See you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.